Ну, прежде всего, я хотела бы начать презентацию с того, что вообще население, бизнес и эксперты являются основными активными участниками в попытке измерить проблему коррупции, так как, чтобы бороться с каким-либо явлением, нужно иметь представление о нем. Процесс, насколько я понимаю, и по международной риторике, и по риторике, которая существует в России, довольно сложный. Тем не менее, ведущие международные организации, в том числе Мировой банк, Transparency International, Банк экономического развития, предпринимают попытки, и даже более-менее регулярные, чтобы мерить настроение, представление, пытаться как-то оценивать. В частности, вот в первом слайде я попыталась скомбинировать информацию из различных источников. Ну, здесь, во-первых, приведен Corruption Perception Index Transparency International, индекс, который считает World Economic Forum по опросам предприятий, и представление населения, в данном случае представлено Евробарометром. Я попыталась типологизировать европейские страны, ну, прежде всего это ЕС, здесь представлены страны ЕС, 27, и сопоставить с ситуацией в России. Все-таки, с одной стороны, мы активно говорим о модернизации, о развитии, необходимости развития ценностей и неких проектов, а это, в общем, скажем так, шаблон западной культуры, европейской культуры, достаточно эффективную модель демонстрирует. А с другой стороны, мы очень тесно связаны с Европой и экономически, и исторически. И, в частности, с блоком Восточной Европы, ранее входящую в бывший социалистический лагерь, то есть имеем некий общий исторический путь. Так вот, насколько разошлись на этом пути или наоборот, мы сталкиваемся с теми же вызовами. Как оказалось, в принципе, хотя, как очевидно, Восточный блок находится в группе стран с высоким риском коррупции, к среднему уровню коррупции относятся лишь две страны по рейтингу и вообще по ответам населения. Это Эстония и Польша. Они действительно демонстрируют замечательные устойчивые результаты в течение 15-10 лет. А остальная же Восточная Европа оказывается среди стран с высокой коррупцией наряду с Южной Европой. Блестящие результаты показывают страны Северной Европы. В общем, это определяется довольно длительной традицией демократических институтов и прозрачного администрирования институтов и достаточно серьезного социального общественного контроля. Среднюю группу стран представляет Центральная Европа, ну, условно я определила как Центральная Европа, континентальная, но сюда включена еще и Великобритания. Россия же вот по различным рейтингам устойчиво находится в зоне стран с очень высоким уровнем коррупции. Среди ЕС это похожее положение в рейтингах занимает Греция. А теперь я бы хотела перейти уже к представлениям самого населения, о представлении бизнеса и населения о коррупции, в том числе о самой природе коррупции. Следует сказать, что вот это разложение по оси от низкого уровня коррупции, относительно низкого, к более высокому, очень тесно связано с представлением населения о том, и очень коррелирует с представлением о том, какова роль государства, и с вообще уровнем развития демократических институтов. В частности, внизу, самой нижней, значит, позиции ячейки указывается доля респондентов, которые отмечают, согласно с утверждением, что политика и страна управляется группой лиц или группами лиц в собственных интересах. Очевидно, что, например, в Северной Европе с этим согласны не более трети опрошенных. жителей, чем ниже позиция в антикоррупционном рейтинге страны, тем чаще люди склонны говорить о том, что власть и политика формируются с учетом интересов и корысти небольшой группы лиц. В России, в частности, 80% согласны с подобным утверждением. Следует сказать, что если обратиться к опросам бизнеса, то 80% бизнесменов считают, что бизнес-интересы ближайшего окружения первых лиц страны оказывают самое прямое, непосредственное влияние на формирование политики в стране. Кроме того, о роли государства в формировании некой коррупционной модели или в неком характере антикоррупционной политики говорит и то, что среди россиян чаще всего выбирают в качестве причин, которые не дают либо предотвращать распространяться коррупции, эффективно бороться, это причины, связанные с коррупционными интересами самих властных структур. Это характерно, в частности, и для Восточной Европы, и для Южной Европы. Какое же представление о роли бизнеса и властей и о вовлеченности бизнеса в коррупционные практики у обычного обывателя, обычного, в частности, потребителя? Мне кажется, это важно, потому что это как раз один из элементов и компонентов того самого доверия, которое и общего генерализованного доверия в стране, и доверия к бизнесу. И, соответственно, таким образом, наверное, и в таком аспекте могут восприниматься даже, если существует некий общий негативный стереотип, наверное, не так замечательно будут восприниматься компании, соблюдающие действительно деловую этику, законы в плане противодействия коррупции, занимающиеся социальными инициативами, наверное, не настолько они могут получить вот эти социальные бенефиты, как ожидают от своих правильных действий, если существует некий общий негативный стереотип. Но следует отметить, что довольно устойчивое мнение среди россиян, что, во-первых, коррупция весьма распространена в бизнес-кругах в России, и очень похожие показатели, опять же, с Южной и Восточной Европы. Восточная Европа я бы определила как южная подгруппа. Внизу вот отмечено, что она включает Чехию, Словакию, Венгрию, Румынию и Болгарию. Кроме того, считает, как бы в представлениях россиян, вот эти связи, если речь идет о неформальных связях, как, значит, более общем явлении бизнеса и властей, то за последние 10 лет, по мнению 80% опрошенных, эти связи сохранились либо даже усилились. При этом, опять же, здесь очень близкие по интенциям ответы у Восточной Европы и Южной Европы о том, что проблема коррупции связана с тем, что слишком близкие взаимоотношения бизнеса и политики. И кроме того, еще такой важный аспект о том, что вообще неформальные связи являются, если не, с одной стороны, необходимым условием для того, чтобы начинать либо сохранить бизнес, но даже это, возможно, становится в глазах обычных людей историей успеха. Что для того, чтобы делать успешный бизнес, нужно обязательно иметь того самого влиятельного инсайдера, влиятельные знакомства и иметь как бы правильных людей во власти. Интересно, что вот подобные представления, понимание о связях, неформальных связях между бизнесом и властями, они формировались задолго, то есть еще с начала формирования новой России. Вы видите, здесь приведена некая история опросов, и очевидно, что подавляющее большинство населения сообщает о том, что слишком большое влияние, например, крупного бизнеса, что крупный бизнес широко распространен в России, что, как правило, крупные чиновники, например, в Москве, привыкли брать взятки у бизнеса. Но при этом следует отметить, что бизнес бизнесу рознь, восприятие крупного бизнеса и малого различно с точки зрения населения. Чаще некое вот такое влияние имеет крупный бизнес и очень тесные связи, преобладание, а малый бизнес, он скорее имеет такое состояние некой, ну, условно говоря, жертвы. То есть он подчиняется требованиям формальным, неформальным, описанным чиновниками, вынужден подчиняться. Что говорят о том, насколько распространены взятки и неформальные отношения, насколько они важны, сам бизнес. Оказывается, что в принципе нельзя сказать, что вот по ответам, когда мы формулировали вопрос, как вы считаете, в вашем кругу бизнесменов, как часто вынуждены давать взятки, откаты, участвуя в государственных контрактах, участвуя в судебных разбирательствах, значит, оплачивая услуги нужных людей за какую-либо официальную бумагу. Оказалось, что от 10 до 15% имеет представление, что якобы это происходит часто. Но, тем не менее, нельзя назвать, что это редкое явление в бизнесе. Скорее, это явление, которое бизнес рассматривает как некая мера, к которой приходится время от времени прибегать. По крайней мере, вот так они признались. Но, тем не менее, очевидно, что гораздо серьезнее вот это представление о том, что все-таки весьма необходимо существование неформальных связей, неформального сектора и представление о том, что ты несешь берешь на себя некие обязательства в том случае, если тебе помогли в довольно тяжелой и плохой ситуации. Дело в том, что вообще представления о бизнесе очень влияют на то, какова... Это не является необходимым условием участия в самом коррупционном акте, то есть в сдаче взятки. Но, тем не менее, есть такой эффект. При высоком уровне коррупции, эффект Ротштейна, есть эффект коррупционных ожиданий. Соответственно, обычный человек понимает, что от него... Именно по его представлениям он понимает, что от него ожидают взятку, и он идет на эту взятку, а иначе представляя некое наказание неполучения услуги, например, от доктора или неполучения нужной бумаги. И в итоге оказывается, что в странах с высоким коррупционным рейтингом достаточно высокий процент и административной бытовой коррупции. Здесь представлено, насколько часто сталкивается с этим население, верхняя часть, и нижняя часть, насколько часто сталкиваются компании. В принципе, опять же, можно сказать, что бизнес дает, не все бизнесмены и предприниматели, следует отметить, что в верхней части указано, например, независимые предприниматели, которые участвовали в общероссийском опросе. Внизу это сам бизнес, и следует отметить, что дают взятки не все, но это отнюдь не редкость, и есть довольно проблемные зоны, связанные, например, с получением разрешений, с получением разрешений на подключение к электросетям, к получением разрешений на реконструкцию, на конструкцию здания, регистрации бизнеса. Следует отметить, что вот здесь ссылка есть на опрос Европейского банка реконструкции и развития, и можно было сравнить данные 2009-2012 года. Действительно отмечалось прошлый день о том, что за этот период несколько снизилась вот эти коррупционные интенции и готовность бизнеса платить И в этом опросе это тоже фиксируется, что несколько снижается. Но нельзя сказать, что это микроскопическое, как, например, это очевидно по уровню административной коррупции в благополучных странах Северной и Центральной Европы. Интересный момент – это само понимание, что порицаемо, а что не порицаемо. Дело в том, что среди россиян довольно распространенное представление о том, что с точки зрения юридического является порицаемое и наказуемое как факт коррупции, а в обычной жизни воспринимается как обычная нормальная практика. Практика там, своего доктора, практика своего чиновника, практика некого оказания услуги, подарков, взаимного сговора. И сам бизнес оценивает и говорит о том, что ему удобнее работать там, где работают, в принципе, формальные правила. То есть у него есть возможность получить разрешение, но тем не менее он прибегает к неформальным платежам, чтобы ускорить свой процесс, получить некую преференцию. Сложнее ему работать в четких формальных правилах, где довольно долгое время требуется для того, чтобы получить разрешение. А вот совершенно невозможно и оценивают как абсолютно некомфортные условия тогда, когда не существует ни формальных, ни неформальных правил работы с чиновником, то есть чиновники не берут на себя никаких гарантий, либо ситуация, когда в принципе возможно неформальное решение, но страшнее всего оказывается вот это влияние лидера, которое было показано и в прошлый день, вот эта модель, когда возникает лидер и возникает некая вертикаль. И, в принципе, с точки зрения бизнеса, это, оказывается, наиболее некомфортное условие. Пока я могу только вот так вот закончить. Готова ответить на вопрос.
We have time for a couple of questions. Слава.
У меня не вопрос, а небольшой комментарий, такой из двух частей. Я довольно много занимался сам опросами, и в основном я сам занимался опросами предпринимателей, но и какое-то время назад очень хорошо, близко соприкасался с опросами населения. Я бы замечание сделал два. Что касается населения, то, конечно, надо понимать, что очень много людей просто повторяют в вопросах то, что слышат и видят по телевизору. И в частности из этого следует, что от формулировки зависит очень, если это совпадает с тем, что люди привыкли слышать, то у них есть готовый ответ. А что касается предпринимателей и предприятий, то тоже тут есть некая тонкость. Я помню, что я разговаривал с одним очень успешным предпринимателем, который мне объяснил, что вот взятки и обмены услугами, как он выразился, это для шпаны, для людей, у которых нет нормальных человеческих отношений с теми же чиновниками, а для тех, кто просто по-человечески с ними дружат или знакомы и как-то входят в некоторые сообщества, в какую-то элиту, это даже не взятки, а это просто человеческие отношения, так как мы помогаем родственникам, друзьям. И это тоже стоит учесть.
Вот об этом я как раз попыталась сказать, о том, что касается буквы закона, и, в общем, Россия адаптирует, например, в том числе и европейские конвенции, и международные конвенции, то, что, в принципе, уже сейчас подпадает под коррупцию, эти практики, с этими практиками жили люди, в общем, почему и Восточная Европа достаточно близка нам, потому что вот эта ситуация существование своих людей, практики блата, неформальных отношений. И вообще это, условно говоря, по-человечески относиться. Вот. И пока не произошло вот этого как controversial, понимание того, что это, наверное, не всегда хорошо, тот же самый сговор. Хотя, в принципе, индивидуальный выигрыш идет. Я к тебе по-человечески отнесся, и ты ко мне. Но в целом влияние и социальное, и влияние на общество, на экономику, то есть на макроуровне, с точки зрения экономики и социальной, и вообще развития общества, представление, как по правилам жить или нет, это губительно. Вот почему и важно нам, что представляет население об этих практиках. Это в том числе то же самое представление о бизнесе и о крупных компаниях, которые, в общем-то, занимаются довольно много компонентов у них, касающихся социальной связи с населением, но есть одновременно вот это представление: ага, они же воруют, ну, конечно же, они должны нам как-то поделиться. То есть вот такое изначально неправильное, мне кажется, в том числе интенция. Хотя само население очень замечательно показывает и то, что оно само вовлекается и готово увлечься вот этими ожиданиями. Когда были приведены результаты о том, что где-то 13% по нашим опросам платили, например, за последний год из обращавшихся за медицинскими услугами, когда задавался вопрос: вам определял кто-то, когда называлось что и как, оказалось, только лишь в половине случаев был четко назван призыв со стороны медработников о необходимости оплатить. Все остальное – это некие представления. И поэтому, конечно же, одной из важных компонентов – это показать пример с головы начать, то есть чтобы высшие чиновники, управленцы, представители крупного бизнеса показали свою чистоту, чистые руки, но одновременно нужно работать и формировать сознание внутри людей, в том числе информация о том, в общем, а что относится к подобной ситуации. А с другой стороны, еще и процедурный вопрос, я просто не успела. Кому довериться, если ты попал в такую ситуацию, которую мало кто идентифицирует, ну, то есть, мне кажется, недооценка идет в общественном сознании, общественном мнении фактов коррупции, что ты платил взятку. Но даже то, что мы отслеживаем, когда мы задаем вопрос, а к кому обращаться, примерно 40% сказали, что они бы пожаловались, хотя наверняка процент будет меньше реального действия, потому что нет даже процедуры операционно, как это должно происходить. Основной канал, к которому вот люди бы сказали, обратились бы, это они назвали полицию. Но полиция называется в России, это одно из наиболее коррумпированных с точки зрения населения структур.
Thank you very much for your presentation. From this conference, I think there have so far been 2 slides that will stay with me for a long time. One was Professor Panarin's yesterday about levels of trust, how they have changed over time. Another was your earlier slide about countries and levels of corruption. If we could go back to that very briefly. This is striking to me for a number of reasons, one of which is that the differences do not seem to track very closely with differences in forms of government over the course of the 20th century. If the United States were in this chart, for example, would probably be in the second category with Poland and Estonia. And so my question perhaps anticipates the afternoon conference and maybe outside the scope of your research, but to what extent do you think forms of government in the 20th century explain these differences, and to what extent do you think it's actually far more complicated than that?
Understand. Sorry.
He's asking, to what extent do you think the form of government explains the level of corruption, and to what extent is it other factors?
Okay. Я думаю, что, конечно же, первоначальный этап формирования новой России, конечно же, внес свой вклад, но это очень важно роль институтов. И в частности, я попыталась представить, что коррупция – это системная проблема. И что в предыдущий, условно говоря, ельцинский период характеризовался еще более слабыми институтами власти, и полиции, судебной реформы, и недостаточно проработанная правовая система. И, в общем, это наследие, оно пока сохраняется, Но плюс еще есть и некий след из советского периода, но это больше связано с представлениями населения, представлениями о бизнесе, что правильно, что неправильно, правильно ли неформальные, какие именно неформальные практики. Но роль институтов здесь действительно тоже важна, потому что это системное явление. Очевидно, что если сравнить с средним, даже средними значениями по Европейскому Союзу, чем более светлая область, тем более сильный институт, и сильный в том плане, что он независим, он прозрачно администрируемый, он отвечает и действует в рамках закона, и он включен в антикоррупционную некую концепцию. И очевидно, что, в общем, с точки зрения экспертов европейского сообщества, потому что вот то, что касается европейского сообщества, это представлено Transparency International по оценкам экспертов. Это специально разработанная модель о интегрированности различных институтов, антикоррупционную модель. Так вот, оказывается, что в наиболее неблагоприятной зоне остаются риски, связанные с лоббированием бизнесом, государственными закупками и финансированием политических кампаний. Для России область, как вы видите, как правило, темная, наиболее темная, наиболее нейтральная. Для России это было построено на основании уже представлений населения, потому что у нас возможности экспертного оценки, экспертного опроса не было. Поэтому вот то, что касается некой общей картины, сформировано на основании опросов бизнеса и населения. Так вот, относительно средней по такому вот представлению о прозрачности, необходимости, нужности находятся позиции негосударственных организаций, омбудсмен, все-таки некоторая система контроля выборов. А вот чем дальше, тем более неблагоприятная даже по сравнению с Восточной Европой, с некоторыми странами Восточной Европы, входящей в первую подгруппу. Это судебная система для России, это сфера, связанная с высокими рисками. Судебная система, полиция, парламент, кроме сферы госзакупок, вообще чиновники, и так далее. Очевидно, насколько темнеет эта область при переходе к следующему политическому институту.
It's time to move on to our next speaker, but please join me in thanking Natalia for a very informative talk. And our next speaker is Don Lang, who joins us from the Arizona State University in the United States.
I'll make one brief comment while we wait for Don. Turn this thing off. All of these slides, I think I mentioned earlier, will be available on my website, Center for Business Ethics and Corporate Governance, and I believe also the university. And I think Natalia had a lot of them that all of us would like to look at in a little bit more timely way. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be here. I want to thank the organizers and sponsors of this conference for giving me the opportunity to be here. I've learned a lot, and I've enjoyed my first visit to this beautiful city. One of my primary interests academic interests is the emergence of bad behavior within organizations. The emergence of corruption and what it is about different organizations that might lead one organization to provide a fertile ground for the emergence of bad behavior and another organization to provide less fertile ground. So that's what I want to talk about today. And the premise is that we might be able to predict, by looking at the configuration of conditions within organizations, what organizations might be most likely to engage in corrupt behavior. So a starting assumption is that the organizational level of analysis is a valid level of analysis for assessing the causes and degrees of corruption in a society. And this assumption built on the work of researchers who have argued that there is significant between organization variance in terms of the level of corruption. And that's even given organizations that are experiencing the same pressures, the same rewards from their environments, that there will be differences among organizations in terms of the degree to which they engage in corrupt behavior. And of course, this also builds on the bad barrels idea that's come up in a couple of presentations right now, today. The idea that in order to fully understand the causes of bad behavior in organizations, it's not enough to look at individuals, not enough to look at evil and stupid people, but to also look at the context that could be creating bad behavior. So when we look at differences among organizations, people talk about differences in resources and capabilities, that some organizations have the ability to pay bribes, other organizations cannot afford to do so. Some organizations have the power to resist paying bribes, other organizations do not have that power. So resources and capabilities are one explanation, but apart from those explanations, are explanations having to do with these specific conditions within organizations that make the organization more or less susceptible to the emergence of corruption. So this leads me to suggest that indirect measurement might be a way to measure organizational corruption that would complement direct measurement. And direct measurement could include interviews of managers about their experience with corruption, and that can yield good information. But those measures will always have significant challenges. So measuring the antecedents of corruption could help provide a fuller picture. And the measurement of antecedents doesn't necessarily need to distinguish between corruption that's on behalf of the organization or at the expense of the organization. Measurements of antecedents can cover both of those destructive kinds of corruption. So to talk about the organization's conditions of corruption control and exactly what we might want to measure, I want to draw on a framework that I published, and I want to build on this today, and I want to emphasize that this is a conceptual idea, this is a theoretical idea, so I don't have empirical results to show you, but I do want to prompt your thinking. And just to start off the framework, I've divided controls into how they're transmitted, either via, at the bottom, either via social, cultural means, or administrative means, and whether they're oriented at the process of in organizations or whether they're oriented toward the outcomes of corruption in organizations. And where this becomes useful is when we look at the crossovers in these dimensions, we can show how they overlap to show how there are 4 different functions of corruption control in organizations. And one of them is autonomy reduction, limiting people's ability to engage in certain actions. Another is consequence systems, to reward and punish certain behaviors. A third way is to interpret and transmit to internal actors in the organization external pressures for legal, regulatory compliance and social conformity. And a fourth is to nurture individuals' own inclinations to engage in non-corrupt behavior and to reject corrupt behavior. So with that basic framework, which I haven't explained fully, and I apologize for that, but I have to move quickly, now we can get more specific about what we might look for in organizations to determine what we might want to measure in terms of their susceptibility for fostering corruption. So in particular, we'll look at 8 different features. And the first one is in the functional category of autonomy reduction, and this is bureaucratic controls, the existence of bureaucratic controls. The mechanism by which they function is that non-corrupt behavior becomes routinized, and that individuals engage in non-corrupt behavior because it's the path of least resistance to getting the task accomplished. Indicators that we might want to look for in the organization are limits on individuals' freedom to access sensitive data and valuable materials, and limits on individuals' unmonitored action. Those limits could come about through such bureaucratic structures as centralization of decision-making, separation of duties, pre-action authorizations, authorization ceilings, and post-action review. In the next functional category, the category of consequence systems, we would look for punishment controls in organization. The mechanism by which punishment controls work is that individuals conform to non-corrupt behavior in order to avoid undesirable consequences to themselves. Indicators we would look for are that misconduct is clearly defined in the organization so that there are no gray areas. People know the difference between good conduct and bad conduct, that penalties are administered swiftly and decisively, and that there's evidence in the organization that penalties are discussed openly within the organization. Also in the functional category of consequence systems are incentive alignments. The mechanism by which incentive alignment works is that individuals seek non-corrupt outcomes because they have a personal stake in those outcomes. They have something tangible to gain. So indicators that we would look for are that there are evidence of rewards in the organization for non-corrupt behavior, even if that behavior doesn't result in short-term gain for the organization. That there's evidence that people feel that they can be promoted and rewarded in the organization due in part to their high integrity. In the functional category of interpretation and transmission of external environmental pressures come legal and regulatory controls. And the mechanism by which these controls work is that individuals engage in non-corrupt behavior in order to avoid punishment from legal regulatory systems that are external to the organization and that govern the organization's conduct. Indicators that we would look for are that relevant laws and regulations are familiar to insiders, and that there's evidence that the organization is trying to comply with those laws and regulations in terms of their spirit and not just their letter. As a side note, this is probably the least effective of the controls because it assumes that there's an effective and fairly administrated system of laws and regulations to which the organization is responsible. But even more than that, even when there are strict rules, individuals within organizations are rarely punished or held accountable for corporate wrongdoing. And when organizations are held accountable, it tends to be with fines, and those are seldom onerous. And organizations can often shield internal wrongdoing from external review. On a more positive note, also in the category of environmental sanctioning, is social judgments that emanate from the organization's environment. And these include interorganizational norms that develop by social consensus and that dictate acceptable types of action that result in stable patterns of behavior and coordinated interdependencies among entities. They affect trust and predictability among actors and create understood patterns of behavior in exchange relationships. And importantly, these kinds of norms and understandings could emerge from a mutually agreed upon set of standards, such as those in the Russian Compliance Alliance. The mechanism by which they function is that individuals engage in non-corrupt behavior in order to maximize individual and organizational reputation and legitimacy. And given how important those two things are, indicators that we would look for is evidence that the organization engages in collective efforts in the environment to define and monitor and reinforce appropriate behavior, that the expectations of outsiders are familiar to insiders, and there's evidence that the organization is attempting to fulfill the spirit and not just the letter of those expectations. In the functional category of intrinsically oriented controls, we have vigilance controls. These attempt to harness the likelihood that individuals will depart from social norms in ways that are constructive for the organization. Mechanisms by which they function are that individuals are given the autonomy and encouragement to raise objections to corruption when they see it. Indicators that we would look for or that whistleblowing is encouraged and rewarded in the organization, that whistleblowers are protected from retaliation by peers and supervisors, and that there are safe, formal, and effective channels for whistleblowing. Also in the functional category of intrinsically oriented controls are self-controls. And these controls consist of individuals voluntarily striving for constructive conformity with positive norms. The mechanism by which these controls function is that individuals constantly monitor and correct their own behavior in accordance with these positive norms. Indicators we look for is that the organization takes steps to foster the degree with which the individuals socially identify with the organization, define themselves in terms of the company's attributes, and that the organization takes steps to encourage individuals to internalize the company's positive values and beliefs. That could include rigorous selection, ongoing training, management continually sending signals about important values, and so on. In the final type of control, we return to the functional category of autonomy reduction, and here we have concertive controls. Concertive may not translate well into Russian, but the root is concert, and these controls are developed in concert between employees. They also are a way of reducing autonomy because peers decide what's appropriate in the organization and they enforce that. So the mechanisms are that employees jointly establish and enforce norms. Indicators we would look for are that management supports employee participation in decision-making and problem-solving, in developing group interpretations and consensus about key values relevant to work, and developing expectations for one another. So to wrap up, I want to talk about some possible indicators you might look for that cut across all those functional areas, including leadership, evidence that the CEOs and other top executives are positive models for the organization's ethical orientation, that they know what's going on in the organization, that they're approachable, that they value integrity over expediency, and that they set goals that are achievable without corrupt action. Also looking at informal culture, is it consistent with the formal rules and regulations in the organization? Are there heroes that are celebrated for their ethical behavior? Are there rituals in the organization that center on ethics? Are there myths and stories that emphasize the company's values? And then finally, is everything aligned? Are all of the different controls sending the same message with the same goals? So that's a cursory overview of the approach. I hope you found it helpful and inspired your own thinking about how we might look indirectly at how organizations might be more or less fertile ground for the development and the fostering of corruption. Thank you.
We have time for some questions. Andy?
I like your presentation very much, and I'm so persuaded by it that I can't imagine the counter-argument. Who is going to resist? Okay. Who would push back on the presentation that you've just given? What would be the opposition to this?
If somebody takes the position that bad behavior in organizations is pretty much fully explainable by bad decision-making, by bad apples coming into the organization, they might resist the idea that, perhaps, go ahead.
But it would be a difference of degree, would it not?
Yes,
they would
that's
say
right.
that this is less important. They wouldn't dismiss this. They
Exactly,
would say,
I agree.
This is not
Yes.
the principal explanation. Okay.
Agreed.
Anybody would concede that these things, that what you have done is provide a very specific explanation of an important factor. How important it is,
Right.
would be the debate.
I hope that's true, yes. Yes.
I think you mentioned at the beginning that you hadn't done any empirical research on this. Is that right?
That's correct.
So I guess you probably are not yet in a position then to say sort of what the ranking of these things would be in terms of importance with respect to outcomes.
Well, I did say that I think maybe the least important within the organization is the external legal and regulatory sanctions that are transmitted internally. It's not that they're not important, but they may be less important. However, I intentionally show it in this circumplex or pie format in order to give the impression that one does not prevail over the others, that they all are important, and that the configuration of them is important. So that's...
Okay. And in discussion outside the conference, I think you mentioned that you looked at comparisons within industries to see differentiations between different companies who were in the same industry. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Well, the general idea is that even within the same industry, even within the same country, even in the same country culture, that and even with organizations of similar resources and capabilities, that you'll find tremendous variation among organizations. And again, this is not something. This is the next step for this research: is to check this out empirically. But the premise is that there's going to be significant variance among organizations in terms of the degree to which they provide a context for the emergence of corruption, or to put it in a more positive way, the degree to which they stifle corruption, that they don't allow it to emerge. You can help me with that.
More questions? Gemma? Back there.
Thanks. Just to follow up on the last comments there, I think it would be quite interesting, or perhaps it would be interesting, to look at how companies or organizations that undergo radical transformation as a result of a deferred prosecution agreement or even a prosecution, such as Siemens, when you look at the change in the way that they have been organized in the past and how that facilitated bribery and how that has then been changed through their, not only through the controls here that you mentioned, but also from the governance and organizational perspective.
Yes, and that would be a fantastic qualitative study. Maybe Mark can do something. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's also interesting to think about multinational firms who may be entering other markets and how the controls and how the atmosphere within the organization might need to adjust as a result of that.
And also, maybe I could just add, I'm working with a multinational at the moment, a Swiss multinational that has no compliance program, hasn't had a compliance program, but it has 70,000 employees in some of the most challenging jurisdictions in terms of corruption, and how that the high-speed development of a compliance program and a compliance function is actually transforming the whole company and the ethics in that organization.
It's very interesting.
Any last questions?
У меня хулиганский вопрос. Ничего, если я попробую. Видите ли вы что-то общее? Дело в том, что мы говорим, здесь у нас конференция вот про бизнес-этику и национальные стандарты поведения. И вроде бы как Россия в фокусе все-таки наших усилий, но мы получаем большое количество материала, вот, основано на опыте западных стран, Соединенных Штатов прежде всего. Я вот все-таки не очень понимаю, какой проблемой является коррупция в России. Ну, мы вроде все понимаем, и не только русские, но и вот те, кто к нам приезжает. Но вот ощущение, вот лично у меня понимание того, насколько коррупция в Соединенных Штатах ощущается как вот проблема, мне не очень понятно. А мой хулиганский вопрос: видите ли вы общее между борьбой с коррупцией и борьбой с курением? той же мере, в какой вот борьба с вот курение это такая проблема, вот, да, и коррупция это вот тоже такая проблема, как курение. Вот, не знаю, мне кажется, я вдруг подумал, что какие-то очень похожие вещи. Вот. Именно в Соединенных Штатах, допустим. В России это другая ситуация и с курением, и с коррупцией.
I'm not sure exactly how to respond to the smoking part of the question, but part of what I'm learning here, and my expertise is not at all in the differences in our two cultures. So what I'm learning here is to be circumspect about the degree to which what I believe are universal truths may not in fact be universal. And so I'm learning, and when I present a model like this, it comes out of my Western understanding of what leads to corruption within organizations, and I certainly would encourage and love to understand how this model may or may not work in another culture.
Но в какой мере в вашей стране коррупция, на ваш взгляд, является вот такой реальной проблемой, о которой говорят люди, вот считают, что она им мешает жить? Потому что мне, ну вот, почему я сравнивал с борьбой с курением, что в тот момент, когда борьба с курением началась, это было 20 с лишним лет назад, но курение было реально большой проблемой в Соединенных Штатах. Я там жил в это время. Там невозможно было, вот в мотеле, например, если останавливаешься, просто non-smoking room найти было очень сложно, а в остальных там просто невозможно было находиться. Хотя я курящий человек сам, но это было что-то страшное. Вот. Ну и потом, в общем, действительно началась борьба, и как-то, в общем, более-менее победили, но сейчас продолжают добивать уже вот до конца. Вот, что, на мой взгляд, ну, уже делая какие-то лишние вещи, превышая какое-то чувство меры. Вот. А вот с коррупцией, вот я не знаю, вот действительно это тоже такая вот проблема, что вот надо для Соединенных Штатов, с которой серьезно надо бороться, или это тоже, в общем, ну, вещь, которая маргинальная, но вот надо бы ее до конца добить. Вот, и еще помочь другим странам в этом вопросе.
Well, if you look at Natalia's different stratas of countries, we might be closer to the lower level of corruption in the U.S. We're not at the no corruption level. It isn't probably the predominant concern, and yet it is a concern of companies. And let me also say that a lot of the companies that a lot of our companies are international companies, are multinational companies, and doing business in Vietnam and Kenya and Russia. And so that these issues are front and center for many companies that are crossing borders.
Ну, то есть, как я понимаю, для американского бизнеса это вопрос, борьба с коррупцией за рубежом, это вопрос честной конкуренции между американскими компаниями. Если говорить о внутреннем значении борьбы с коррупцией в других странах, с которыми американский бизнес имеет дело, то внутренний интерес американского бизнеса – это честная конкуренция. Ну, я как экономист в данном случае просто это так понимаю. Или это что-то другое?
I think, yes.
I can't let this one pass by. I think it's a huge problem in our country, and I think anybody who thinks back to 2008 will agree that corruption in the Western business system can do catastrophic damage to the world economy, and 2008 was largely a failure of ethics. That is the findings of the committee that was appointed to look into it. This General Motors thing, which I mentioned earlier today, which caused many deaths in our country, was a failure of ethics, basically. When we have a failure of ethics, it can be really enormous, but I think 2008 is probably the most dramatic of that. So I think it's at least as big. I don't know that we talk about it in the right ways, but I think it's at least as big. It's not. It certainly should not be an issue of competition in developing countries. We'd like to set a good example, but I'm not so sure that we always do that.
Agreed.
Yeah.
We have time for one last question.
Yeah, hi, Professor. So that was quite interesting. So my company, we build factories and distribution centers for multinationals. And we have customers that are Russian, Scandinavian, German, American. And I can tell you that we deal with every mix of your pie that I've seen. And I think, as you mentioned, the putting in some sort of vector for economic development of the environment in which is being operated is probably useful, because what we observe from working with our customers is that they just don't know how to approach measurement and control in this environment, which is generally not a data-rich environment as of yet. So we have a lot of work to do to help people in Russia. Please continue.
Okay. Very good. Thank you.
Спасибо большое. Я позволю небольшую шутку рассказать, прежде чем задать вопрос. В России спросили одного бизнесмена, в чем разница между взяточничеством и коррупцией. Он ответил следующим образом, что взяточничество – это когда чиновник берет взятку, обещает что-то сделать за эти деньги и делает то, что обещал. А коррупция – это когда чиновник просто берет деньги и ничего не делает. И с этим нужно бороться, бороться и бороться. А в этой связи у меня вопрос. Вот действительно на проблему коррупции влияет эффективность государственного управления, эффективность принятия решений. Насколько, на ваш взгляд, влияет на уровень коррупции профессиональный уровень, профессиональная подготовка государственных служащих, государственного аппарата? Потому что часто такое ощущение, что люди не то что бесплатно в госаппарате, а за деньги не могут некоторые функции свои выполнять просто в силу своего низкого профессионального уровня.
It's a hard question to answer. And to me, the organization, the top managers of organizations have a great deal of influence over how they relay these kinds of pressures from the environment into the internal workings of the organization. And I think if I'm talking about measuring how fertile a ground an organization is for corruption, I would say how effective are the top managers at actually making sure that any external pressures from the environment are present within the organization and they are actually influencing behavior. And I realize that's not a very direct answer to your question, but it's the best I can do.
And I'm sorry, my co-chair is going to kill me for saying something because we need to get Rita up here. But actually, the truth is that I go back to 2008 example, Edward. One reason that occurred was because the people who were in a position to be doing the auditing at the Securities Exchange Commission, for example, were simply not qualified to do it. They didn't understand the kind of financial situations that they were looking at. So I think that's a big problem everywhere, and certainly it is in our country and probably in Russia too. Okay, now I promise.
Once again, we have much to discuss over lunch, but join me right now in thanking Don Lang for an interesting presentation. And our next speaker is Ritva Ranika, who is an independent economist, formerly associated and a director at the World Bank, who joins us from Finland.
I think it's worth noting that we've seen her name about 3 times in the last couple of presentations as a reference for other people's work. So we're very pleased to have her today.
Thank you very much. And for my part, I also want to say that I have enjoyed multi-sectoral exchange that we have had in this conference, and I'm very grateful to be in my neighboring city. I'm always saying that my new home now next to the Russian border, I'm closer to St. Petersburg than I'm to Helsinki. So this has been really very interesting. My talk is going to be about empirics, how to do empirics and results. So I am not giving a conceptual framework or anything, but of course this is building on conceptual frameworks, and a lot of the discussions we've had yesterday and today really is reflected in this approach. And really mine is quantitative micro-surveys, and let me just sort of more generally first say that there are ways of getting into corruption issues concretely. There are surveys, you can do them quite well, despite the fact that corruption is secretive activity. And often in the past, at least, there was a view that it can't be measured. It can be measured. Nothing is perfect, but you can make a serious effort to measure it. Also, I want to emphasize that the 3 types of surveys that I will demonstrate are really, they are not just about corruption. Actually, you collect a lot of other information, but I will focus on the corruption activities and especially in the firm surveys. And the 3, perhaps before going to that, I just want to say, although I am called independent economist, the last 20 years I worked at the World Bank, both in the research department as well as in operations. And when you work in an international organization, just referring to the last conversation, you are not really there to tell countries that you are corrupt, or you get nowhere with that kind of thing. So the role of an external agency is really to provide evidence to the discussion, work with the country's own institutions, organizations, academia, etc., to highlight some what we consider relevant issues. And then one of the features when you work at the World Bank is that you usually do these things across the world, or at least across the developing world. So that's really kind of the perspective. And also when dealing with, we are always about reform and change. And when you try to persuade, you try to contribute to the change, you always want to be very specific, and you want to try and focus on the issues that are really important. And you are interested what happens over time, what is the pertinent issue for now. So this type of moral judgment that this is better than that, we just shy away from that kind of thing altogether. So the 3 types of surveys are really, one has to do with the public sector. It has to do with spending public money and behavior in public service. My work has always focused on transaction-intensive and discretionary services, meaning services where there are lots of service providers, where human behavior is important. So when you use a road, it doesn't require anybody to deliver that service, but when you go to school, you have to go there minimum, or at least in many cases, 12 years, every day, etc. A doctor, you go to the doctor because you don't know what your problem is. There's asymmetric information and discretionary thing. So therefore, it really matters what these providers do and what they know and what they do. So, and also perhaps about corruption, sort of when, to me it's different from smoking, because corruption is an outcome. It's an outcome of many, many things. It's not an action as such. When you don't have good, corruption is a symptom. It's an outcome of institutional, historical, all kinds of things that we have been discussing in this conference. So the first type of survey I will briefly mention and show some results is called Public Expenditure Tracking Survey. And that came from a realization that in a number of countries, public spending tripled and there was just no impact on, let's say, enrollment in education in that case. So you start thinking, okay, maybe money doesn't reach the place. How do you find then this out? You do a survey of schools or survey of clinics when you have that kind of question. And I want to highlight that in contrast to Natalia's presentation, the surveys we have worked on are all quantitative. They can have some perception questions, but the strength of these surveys is that they collect quantitative information. So when we do a public expenditure tracking survey, here I'm just showing some examples of non-wage funding to schools, like capitation grant is very common in many schools that do not reach the schools. So here, my work has often been in poor countries, largely, not always, but a lot in poor countries. These are all pretty poor countries. Peru is the only middle-income country. And you can see in this one particular year, 78% of public spending on school capitation grant didn't go to Ugandan schools. So clearly a big problem. What do you do in these surveys? You collect the data from the books. You collect the funding from the books, and you also triangulate. You collect it at the school level, at the local government level, and at the central level. You triangulate the data and derive the quantitative evidence. This focuses on funds, and when the Ugandans heard that most of their capitation grant is robbed by local officials and don't go to the kids, they acted. Next week, they put a public information campaign. Ever since, even today, this already happened long ago. Even today, when you go to the country, every day almost you see Treasury advertising in the newspaper what money has gone to the local governments. Schools put posters, newspapers everywhere having that. So there was a reaction to it, and that's what in the mixture of the World Bank where you mix research and action, that's what we wanted to see. And that is now, I go to other poor countries, went to Sierra Leone the other day, the newspaper is no more than 8 pages, so 2 pages was devoted to the publication of this. It's one way of trying to tackle what you see here in these numbers is a serious problem. So these public expenditure tracking surveys are being done all over the world, and it's kind of a routine survey approach because these systems never produce data what is actually being spent at the local level. So always the perspective in this work is the poor person's perspective, the citizen perspective, and you look your provider at the front line to understand what kind of service you are getting. The other, so that's about the public expenditure tracking surveys. The second type of surveys is is sort of service provider surveys. And where does this all come from? It comes from a thinking that public spending is, mankind has two big things to promote development: economic growth and public spending. So this focuses on public spending. Why is public spending not same as good services? There are fundamentally 4 reasons. 1, public spending usually benefits the rich. It's very, very common. You can do incidence studies and you can see it. Secondly, money doesn't reach. No, okay, these public expenditure tracking surveys can tell you that. Third, even if the money reaches and the service providers are there, they don't do what they are supposed to be doing. And we are now often talking about poor countries where this is a really acute problem and where the need is the biggest. So like here are provider absence rates from a selection of countries, again done by surveys. When you do absence rates, you need to design the survey, surprise visits, you need to do it twice so that you get the right thing. You do the listing first and second. But it's a type of a leakage, if you want. You can see in India, in primary health centers, 40% of staff aren't there. And surely when this data gets to the public dialogue, it really has an impact. In this genre of looking at what service providers do, we do have a very large project going on now, which is called Service Delivery Indicators. Here's just one example of it. It's again sample-based, but the data collection is not now focusing on money. It's recognizing that in health and education, the key service element is the provider person. What that person knows and what that person does is really a key thing. So again, so through this, we do this same way across countries. And for instance, in Kenya, this is pretty new, you can see that teachers are absent from school, they are absent from class, they are in class but are not teaching, and they are in class teaching. So 55% of the input they are supposed to be having is actually actual teaching. These are then data that you start discussing with your counterparts, and actually what we do is feed this into public conversations to help NGOs and civil society organizations and others to really address the issue, because it's really a big problem. In Tanzanian urban schools, we found that teachers only teach 1 hour, 24 minutes. And that is just simply, that's a national average. That just isn't enough. So through this this is a very elaborate way of collecting this information. And why I'm happy to be sharing this with you, because also this data is all becoming available. And also some researchers in Russia, I spoke with Daniel earlier during the conference, and there are people who are interested in doing research in other countries. So I encourage you who do research to make use of this data, because it's pretty costly, several $100,000 each survey that you make. Just on this happens in education and health. And I wanted to just mention, with reference to the earlier, and particularly Jocelyn's talk also, in a way when you say, what does the service provider know and what does he or she do? So for instance, in this Kenya context, 58% of health providers were able to correctly diagnose 4 out of 5 conditions. But then when this survey approach, or when you conduct the module, what do they actually do? It's much, much lower percentage, 44% in this case. And what was very fascinating is when we do, like in economics, you always use statistical methods, it was not at all correlated with training. Okay, so these are 2 types of surveys: service provider surveys and public expenditure tracking surveys that follow the money. The third one I wanted to talk about briefly and show some results for Russia is the Business Environment and Enterprise Performance Survey that also Natalie had briefly in her presentation. This is a survey that is being done in all Eastern European countries together with the World Bank and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And there, the perspective is the firm's perspective, not multinationals, domestic firms. Yet there may be some, companies that belong to the multinational group, but these are domestic Russian companies. And the latest survey was done 2011-2012, and there are quite a few others. And some of the results I will show are really in comparison with 2008, but there are a number of other surveys. And what is really interesting in this latest survey, that it is regionally representative. So it shows results for the 37 regions in Russia. The first point perhaps to make on this, just to share some of the results, my idea is just to kind of interest you, if possible, that this exists. This would be really worth using much more and go well beyond just descriptive statistics to go in utilizing that data. Because these surveys often have the turnover of the firms, the tax payment, their investment in quantitative terms, and you can tease out many, many things relating to that. But just to say, overall, it looks, using these surveys, that Russia has made significant progress in addressing the administrative burden imposed on firms by regulation. This looks at really regulatory burden from the firm perspective, and then corruption. So the time tax, so to speak, of senior managers has gone down from 22% to 17%. And then you see the various regulatory and administrative areas, so you can see it's no obstacle. So the longer red line means that it's no obstacle. So in a way, you can see that things are by and large better in 2011. So these numbers would give some numbers of the change. However, they are, not everything is totally brilliant and moving to the same direction. I think there is a graph index which is based on firms' actual experience. That has also gone down. From the interactions with bureaucrats, so this is the firm perspective vis-a-vis those who regulate them, from 18 to 8% has that kind of where firms experience demand for a bribe. So it has gone down according to this evidence. There are some, then on the other graph, you can see that there are unofficial payments to get things done in some areas. This is sort of when you ask the firm, is a firm like you can you expect this frequently? So overall, bribe frequency has gone up. So the picture is not entirely one way. Here is just data on kickbacks, on the number of firms that experience them, gone down. But then interestingly, those who have to pay now much more than before. It has gone, and because again, this is quantitative data, so you can calculate it in relation to sales. From 1.7 to 4.5. And just maybe without going into details, I think the Russian enterprise survey, this last round, the regional aspect is very, very interesting because there is a huge variation in corruption faced by firms according to region. It's the single most important factor that is there. And then these researchers, so I'm talking about now a paper that I haven't written myself. The only thing I've done is that I was the first one to develop these types of modules for another country survey, and the Russia survey also uses them. But it's fascinating to see the huge differences among the region. And this paper by Steve Nack and Greg Kisunko, who have analyzed in the bank this survey, and as I said, there's a lot more that can be done. They try every effort to look at what would explain that. Is it GDP? Is it natural resources? They simply don't find any correlates. And one of the issues that they then speculate is to say that, that maybe the incumbents really want to prevent entry, and therefore, you see this type of thing happening. So that's a research question to ask, but unlike in many other countries, the regional variation in Russia is really very large. So this is just in a nutshell a flavor of 3 types of micro-surveys: public expenditure tracking surveys, service provider surveys, and then enterprise surveys, and just a mixture of method and trying to show just a few results. And at this last slide, I do have the references. All this stuff is online. The Russia paper is online. It's very interesting. Service delivery indicators are online. And then I have done with Jakob Svensson a paper some time ago already that kind of brings this conversation together in world development. Thank you.
We have time for some questions. Ed?
Yes, Ritva, thank you very much. It's very interesting. So I have a couple of questions and a comment. I understand that the data you described are available on the World Site Bank. Is that right? And my next question would be, are there comparable data for other countries collected by the World Bank? And if so, how many countries are available? Because, of course, my lab would be interested in doing a cross-country comparison. And finally, the comment that I have pertains to the regional variation and corruption. There is a ongoing study that tried to identify correlates between bribery and various social indicators across Russia's region. And surprisingly, a very almost the only one was a negative correlation with corruption. I mean crime. I'm sorry. That is, in those regions where crime is low, bribery is high, and also the other way around. And if one could try and interpret this theoretically, this may be related to the state capacity. Right, so in those places where the state, the government, as they say in the US, is strong, it can ensure calm and and peace and quiet, but it also can ensure that people pay their dues, both formally in the form of taxes and informally.
So just to answer about the data, especially the enterprise survey data are on the bank website, because this enterprise survey project, both the BEEPS, which is the Eastern Europe, Central Asia specific one, but the others are very similar. They have been done across the world. They are anonymized and put on the website. So the private sector people at the World Bank have them. The service, so that exists, and I'm sure, Natalia, you have also gotten access to the BEEPS. I would like, you are a leading researcher here, so I would really like to say that these surveys should be used answering real research questions, not just giving like, some statistics. The service delivery survey is new and it's coming online. It's really funny, we used to be in the World Bank, the ones who had the money and we dictated this and that. Nowadays we get the money from foundations, so the service delivery indicators is actually funded by Hewlett Foundation, Laura and William Hewlett Foundation, and they put conditions on us and they say data needs to be public. So that has so far focused on Africa, where the issue is the biggest, but those data will also become available. And I think I would encourage you, I personally see the World Bank as an international public good. You should just demand to get the stuff because it's with big money produced there. So I highly, highly encourage, they make great dissertations, and I published many, many papers using the firm surveys. And I don't know about the crime and the bribery. That's a very interesting piece of work. Just maybe in the work that I've done, different context, again, a poor country, and especially my colleague Jakob Svensson did a paper asking a question, is bribery sand or is it a grease in the wheels? And in this particular country, it was sand, because the one who takes the corrupt money knows who can pay. So it's basically ability to pay. And this particular country, was coming out of conflict and so forth, and the president was very much in investment kind of a president. So we tried to use this evidence and say, please, combat corruption more, show leadership more, because your best investors are really suffering from it. So that's an example of a quantitative data use where you can really answer a question. It is harming the best firms. But this crime, and that's a great topic, and but I don't have any evidence from these things on it.
More questions? Yes.
Dear Rita, thank you very much for your presentation. It was really very interesting. My name is Elena and I work here at university. And doing my first steps in science, I got very interested in your empirical data because you spoke about Kenya and India, so countries that are not widely presented in mainstream. And can you please tell me how is it possible to carry out research in countries, with high political risks, for example, Afghanistan or North Korea? All in all, is it possible in general? And the second small question, is there a sort of correlation between, for example, if a researcher comes from Portugal, he or she is sure to carry out research in Mozambique or in Cabo Verde or, countries where they speak Portuguese, or, for example, if a researcher comes from, Spain, he or she is highly probable to study, Mexico or Argentina, or it's not important. So, for example, a researcher from Russia can study Tanzania and or other countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think it's wonderful to hear this question, and I've heard from a few people interest of also expanding, to other countries. I do think, obviously, and when I was director of a department in the Africa region, my task manager in Portugal in Mozambique and Angola was a Portuguese lady. So it is true, you need to have that language. You learn languages, but I think in those countries, Russia has an advantage because these are Soviet allies from the past. You have a trust fund with them, which we actually administer, etc. So it's quite possible. Even me, I'm a Finn. Nobody speaks Finnish, so I have to learn other languages in order to do anything. But I do think that I highly encourage you, particularly young people, go out to the world and do it. And somehow work with your professors who have maybe more clout than you have as a student to connect. You have a super excellent country director here who is research oriented. He's a Polish economist, and just push them to find the connections. One way to do it is to go and be a summer intern, and even me, I can try and help, you know, because I still know everybody there, so after 20 years. So you need to be a bit more persistent, but it's totally possible. What is not easily possible as an individual to start implementing these things? These surveys always cost minimum $200,000. So you need financial might. That's why I'm saying that combining forces with others and kind of really demanding your share of that international public good. Use those data. But it takes an effort, but I absolutely encourage you to do it, and it can be done. And Russia is now a donor in the fund for the poorest countries, the 81, I think, which we call IDA. So Russia has an executive director at the World Bank, just for Russia. So just put these representatives of yours to work so that they. But it takes an effort, but I highly encourage you to take that effort. It's very rewarding.
Any last question? Then please join me in thanking Ritva for a very informative discussion. Yeah. This is the last panel that I am chairing, so allow me to thank each and every person who's participated. I have personally learned so much, and I'm very grateful. I also want to warmly thank my co-hosts, Slava and Pat. I remind you that after lunch, we're going to have a wide open discussion of the differences between, some differences between Russia and other places. And after that discussion, the university has arranged a fabulous dinner. Do not miss the dinner tonight. Right now, we need to hurry off to lunch. Slava asked me to tell you that the lunch will be in the same place as yesterday, and we will be led there by the same person as yesterday, and his name is Boris. So please, spasiba, Boris. Thank you very much. Everyone's invited.